So first, I'm going to read the student booklet so you can follow along if you would like to hear me read the questions to you, and if not, you can skip to me reading the magazine. So instructions. Read the magazine to answer the questions below. Some answers you can find directly in the text, but others will require you to think carefully, reflect, and use your own ideas. Not every answer can be copied. You will need to show your understanding. So the first section is understanding the land, and it shows there the curricular outcome that we're going to be targeting with this, which is correlate the impact of the land on lifestyles and settlement patterns in Saskatchewan. So on page 7, we can find the answers to these two questions. So number 1, the land shaped how people lived. Page 7. What natural resources were important to the fur trade? And if you see a little star like this on a word when you're reading, that means that it's going to have a little note or a definition about it at the bottom of the page, which is right here. So what natural resources were important to the fur trade? And so the little note says natural resources are materials and components found in the environment that exist without human intervention and are used to support life, create products, and generate energy. These include sunlight, water, air, land, minerals, plants, and animals. B. Why did fur traders travel by canoe and river instead of building roads? So on the next page, number 2 is on settlements and trading posts. So use pages 6 and 7 and 14 and 17. A. Where were many trading posts built? Circle all that apply. Near rivers, in forests, on the prairies, and near lakes. B. Why were these locations important? 3. Life on the land. Use pages 6 and 7 and 22 and 23. Describe 2 ways the land affected how fur traders and voyagers lived their daily lives. 4. Food and survival. Use page 7. What was pemmican and why was it important for survival? So this section is First Nations and Métis relationships with the land. And so the curricular outcome there says explain the relationship of First Nations and Métis peoples with the land. So number 5 is Indigenous knowledge. Use page 12. How did First Nations people help the fur traders survive and travel? B. Why was their knowledge of the land so important? 6. Using the land respectfully. Use pages 11 and 12. List 3 ways First Nations peoples used animals from the land. Example, food, tools, and clothing. Number 7, the role of women. Use page 9. What important jobs did Indigenous women do in the fur trade? List at least 3. Number 8, Métis people. Use pages 9 and 12. A. Who are the Métis? B. How did the fur trade lead to the creation of the Métis people? 9. Changing relationships with the land. Use pages 12 and 13. The fur trade changed how some Indigenous people lived. Give 2 examples of how life changed. Next section is treaties and their impacts. So the outcome says analyze the implications of the treaty relationship in Saskatchewan. So number 10, before treaties. Use page 12. Before Europeans arrived, how did First Nations people live on the land? 11, changes brought by the fur trade. Use pages 12 and 13. How did the fur trade lead to conflict between groups of people? 12. Land and ownership. Use page 13. What happened when Rupert's Land was sold to Canada in 1869? 13. Why treaties were needed. Use pages 13 and 17. Why did the government begin making treaties with First Nations peoples? 14. Treaty impacts. Use pages 12 and 13. Circle whether each statement is positive or negative for First Nations peoples. Loss of land. Positive, negative. Access to new tools. Positive, negative. Spread of diseases. Positive, negative. Creation of agreements with the government. Positive, negative. 15. In your opinion, was the fur trade more helpful or harmful for First Nations peoples? Explain your thinking. This says reflection and connections. So no page numbers are needed. You are to use your own thinking and what you learned. So 16, draw and label. Draw a simple fur trade scene and label at least 4 important parts. 17, make a connection. How does learning about the fur trade help you understand Saskatchewan today? And the last question, number 18, is an exit reflection. 1 new thing I learned and 1 question I still have. So now we're going to go through the magazine, and I'm only going to read the pages that is referred to in the student booklet. So here's our cover. So our first page is page 6. So the business that created a country. It's amazing to think that without a fad for a certain kind of hat, Canada might not exist, and the lives of Indigenous people would probably be completely different. Whether you think it mostly helped or harmed, there's no question that the fur trade changed everything. Hats made from beaver pelts were such hot fashion items in Europe in the 1500s that within 20 years, there were almost no beavers left there. Meanwhile, European fishermen on the east coast of what's now Canada were trading with Indigenous people for food and furs. Most men who settled in New France in the early to mid 1600s hoped to farm, but there were so few women that only 1 man in 7 could find a wife and start a family to help him with the crops and animals. Many Frenchmen took off into the wilderness instead to make their living trading with Indigenous people for the furs Europeans desperately wanted. The coureurs de bois usually worked on their own. They were experts at traveling the wilderness, whether on water or land, and also traded for furs. Voyageurs usually worked for a company, and mostly just paddled others who did the actual trading. Page 7. These voyageurs and coureurs de bois, the runners of the woods, paddled thousands of kilometers from Montreal into what was known then as the Northwest. They were looking for beaver, but also traded for what were called fancy furs, such as fox, marten, mink, fisher, and others. Sometimes the traders went right to where Indigenous hunters and trappers lived, and sometimes the Indigenous people came to the trading posts set up by the Europeans, mainly the English and Scottish. For 250 years, the fur trade boomed. It supported explorers who pushed west and north, mapping their journeys along the way. Its fur trade posts led European settlers all the way to the coast of British Columbia. By the 1820s, beavers and many other fur-bearing animals had been severely overhunted. In the 1830s, cheaper silk hats became fashionable, with even more types of cloth soon driving prices down even more. Within about 40 years, the trade in beaver pelts was pretty much over. Pemmican power. Paddling for 10 to 12 hours a day meant voyageurs and others in the fur trade needed a lot of calories to keep them going. They depended on pemmican, dried bison meat pounded into a powder and mixed with melted fat and sometimes berries. Pemmican was easy to carry and slow to spoil, and a little bit of it provided a lot of energy. Page 9. women workers. So the fur trade wouldn't have existed without non-stop work by Indigenous women. They made snowshoes, moccasins, and all kinds of clothes. They repaired canoes, planted and harvested corn, chopped firewood, prepared animal skins and pelts for sale, washed clothes, and cooked meals. They also made the all-important pemmican. Because of their many skills, Indigenous women were allowed to work in fur trade posts, places where European women were not allowed because life there was thought to be too rough for them. Men who worked for the fur companies often married Indigenous women, known as country wives. No doubt many were truly caring relationships, but it was also cheaper for these men to carry Indigenous women than to pay them for all the work they did. The children of fur traders and Indigenous women were the first Métis people. Some of these marriages survived, but many men in the fur trade simply left with these women and children behind when they returned to Europe and married again. Indigenous women working at York Factory in 1800 made 650 pairs of moccasins for men to wear that summer. Page 11. What a beaver bought. For a while, each trading post offered different things in exchange for furs. Smart Aboriginal people shopped around for the best deal. Eventually, Hudson's Bay factors caught on and set up what they called a standard of trade, so that everyone used the same system. Here's how it worked in Fort Albany in 1733. So 1 beaver could get you 2 combs, or 20 fish hooks, or a pair of pants, or 2 red feathers, or 3/4 of a pound of buttons. 4 beavers could get you a pistol, or 2 mirrors, or 6 thimbles, these are used in sewing, or 8 knives. The fur trade is very different now. Most fur, such as mink and fox, comes from animals raised on farms, but First Nations and Inuit still trap animals and sell their furs under strict rules. So this is page 12. No going back. All of the voyagers and traders and posts and factories would have been useless without hundreds and thousands of furs. And those furs existed because of the skills of the Indigenous people who hunted and trapped the animals and prepared the pelts for trade. It's unlikely Europeans on their own could have ever found, trapped, hunted, transported, and processed the animals whose pelts were so desired back home. The knowledge and abilities Indigenous people had were crucial. Yes, Indigenous people got new and helpful items in exchange for furs, but the fur trade also changed their lives forever, in ways that the first hunters offering beaver pelts couldn't have imagined. We'll never know what Canada would have been like if traditional Indigenous trading patterns and ways of life had been able to continue on their own, without disruption from the fur trade. Before the fur trade, Indigenous people saw animal skins and furs as valuable because they could be used to make clothing and shelters. When Europeans came to trade useful objects in exchange for furs, it changed the way Indigenous people related to the land and its animals. The strongest men and women were often so busy supplying furs that they had little time left to hunt for food and care for their own families. If a trade mission failed, many would starve. Indigenous groups that had mostly left each other alone started fighting over control of territory and the fur-bearing creatures living there. Page 13. Contact with European traders could be deadly for Indigenous people whose bodies had no defenses against illnesses the traders brought without meaning to. Smallpox, measles, and the flu killed thousands of Indigenous people starting as early as the 1630s. Pemmican, the fuel of the fur trade, required bison meat. That led to overhunting of bison, which had been a source of food for thousands of Indigenous people on the prairies. Over time, many Indigenous peoples came to depend on the fur trade for food, money, and even medical care. They lost the old ways that had worked for so long because they had devoted so much time and energy to supplying the fur trade. Some cruel traders took advantage of Indigenous trade partners by giving them too much alcohol. Pelts could also be traded for guns and bullets, meaning that old rivalries between Indigenous groups became deadlier than ever. When HBC, or Hudson's Bay Company, sold Rupert's Land, a huge area covering about 1/3 of modern Canada, to the new country in 1869, nobody bothered asking the Métis and other Indigenous people living there how they felt about it. Their anger led to the Red River Resistance, which in turn led to the first treaty talks. So page 14, fur trade times. So it's showing a timeline of the fur trade. So 1653, the first voyagers paddle west from Montreal. 1660, 2 men returned from Lake Superior with 100 canoes full of fur. In 1666, British investors, including Prince Rupert, pay these 2 men to explore a fur trading route through Hudson Bay to avoid paying French taxes. 1668 to 1669, the inventors pay for a man to sail the 15-meter Nonsuch, a boat, through a northern route from Gravesend, England, to James Bay to trade for furs. In 1670, the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson's Bay, or the Hudson's Bay Company, forms. 1673 to 1684. Hudson's Bay Company builds forts along Hudson Bay and James Bay. Page 15, continuing the journey. 1682, a group of Montreal merchants forms the Campagne du Nord to compete with HBC, or Hudson's Bay Company. 1713, war between England and France ends. As part of the peace treaty, the French return several Hudson's Bay Company forts to English control. 1715, rats and insects destroy the furs stored in Montreal's warehouses. More furs are needed, and fast. 1768, Hudson's Bay Company sees huge losses as Montrealers push west to get to First Nations before they trade with Hudson Bay Company. 1774, Samuel Hearne builds Cumberland House, the first Hudson's Bay Company fur trade post inland rather than on the coast. 1778, Captain James Cook stops off the BC coast to trade for sea otter fur with Aboriginal people. 1779, English, Scottish, and French-Canadian businessmen in Montreal form the Northwest Company to compete with the Hudson Bay Company. So this is page 16. 1780, an English company makes the first Hudson's Bay Company point blanket with black stitched lines or points. 1788, the Northwest Company builds Fort Chipewyan, or on Lake Athabasca, in what is now northeastern Alberta. 1789, Alexander Mackenzie makes it to the Arctic for the Northwest Company. 1793, the Nor'westers control more than 3/4 of fur sales. Mackenzie reaches the Pacific Ocean by land. 1798, the Hudson's Bay Company introduces its legendary creamy white blanket with green, red, yellow, and blue stripes. This is page 17. 1804, the Northwest Company builds Fort William on northwestern Lake Superior to replace its fort at Grand Portage, now in American territory. 1816, the Battle of Seven Oaks. 1821, the Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay Company combine. In 1825, the Hudson's Bay Company sets up its first post on the West Coast, Fort Vancouver in what is now Washington. 1831, Hudson's Bay Company establishes Lower Fort Garry, just north of Winnipeg. 1870, Rupert's Land becomes part of Canada when Hudson's Bay Company signs the Deed of Surrender. Settlers start to flow west in ever greater numbers, setting up farms, businesses, and towns. And that is all for the pages in the student booklet. If you're interested in reading more, you can absolutely do that after you finish the booklet. There's lots of good information and interesting stories that are told.